The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt outside Clearwater Station, dust swirling in the late afternoon sun as Evangeline Thorne stepped down onto the wooden platform. Her traveling dress, once pristine blue wool, now bore the evidence of 3 weeks on dusty trails. Yet she held herself with the dignified bearing of a woman who refused to let circumstances diminish her spirit. In her gloved hands, she clutched a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in this world, and more importantly, the letters that had brought her 2,000 miles from Boston to this remote corner of Colorado territory. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, barely glanced up from his ledger as she approached. The other passengers, 2 traveling salesmen and a cattleman, had already disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving her alone on the platform with nothing but the sound of cicadas and her own rapidly beating heart. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent that marked her as an Easterner. "I'm looking for Thomas Callahan. I believe he was supposed to meet me here." The station master's head snapped up, his weathered face creasing into lines of surprise and something else, pity perhaps, or discomfort. He set down his pen with deliberate care, as if buying himself time to find the right words. "Ma'am," he began slowly, removing his hat to reveal a balding pate marked by years. "Under the prairie sun, you wouldn't happen to be the young lady who's been corresponding with Tom Callahan, would you?" A chill ran down Evangeline's spine despite the warm evening air. Something in the man's tone, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, sent warning bells clanging in her mind, but she straightened her shoulders and nodded. "I am Miss Evangeline Thorne. Mr. Callahan and I have an arrangement, a marriage arrangement. He was to meet me here this evening." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a carefully folded letter, the paper soft from repeated handling. His last correspondence indicated he would be waiting. The station master's face fell, and he twisted his hat in his hands like a man facing an unpleasant duty. "Miss, I'm afraid I've got some terrible news. There was a fire 3 nights back. The Broken Wheel Saloon burned to the ground. Tom Callahan—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Tom didn't make it out." The words hit Evangeline like a physical blow. The letter fluttered from her suddenly nerveless fingers, and she felt the world tilt sideways. She gripped the edge of the platform's wooden railing, fighting against the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, that's impossible. He just wrote to me. He said he was preparing our home, that he was eager to meet me." Her voice rose with each word, desperation creeping in. There must be some mistake. The older man's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm real sorry, miss. I knew Tom. Good man, worked hard at his ranch. But the fire, it happened so fast. Nobody could get to him in time." Evangeline's mind reeled as the full implications crashed over her. She was alone, 2,000 miles from home, with barely enough money for food, let alone passage back to Boston. Worse still, she had no home to return to. She'd sold everything she owned to make this journey, burned every bridge in her determination to start fresh in the West. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, more to herself than to the station master. The words came out as barely a whisper, but in the growing twilight they seemed to echo. "Well," the man said uncertainly, "there's a boarding house in town, run by Mrs. Henley. Clean place, reasonable rates. You could stay there while you figure things out." Before Evangeline could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught their attention. A lone rider emerged from the gathering dusk, tall and lean in the saddle, his horse moving with the easy gait of an animal accustomed to long distances. As he drew closer, Evangeline could make out more details. Dark hair beneath a worn hat, broad shoulders, clothes that spoke of a working man rather than a dandy. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, tying his horse to the hitching post before turning toward them. In the lamplight spilling from the station, Evangeline caught her first clear look at his face and felt her breath catch. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same strong jaw she'd seen in the tin-type photograph Thomas had sent. The same deep-set eyes, though these were darker, more guarded. But where Thomas had smiled in his photograph, this man's expression was unreadable, almost stern. "Evening, Jasper," the newcomer said to the station master, his voice deep and quiet. Then his gaze settled on Evangeline, and she felt as though those dark eyes were seeing straight through to her soul. "Marcus," Jasper replied with obvious relief. "This here's Miss Evangeline Thorne. She just arrived on the evening stage." He paused meaningfully. "She was engaged to your brother." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. Marcus Callahan, for that's who this had to be, studied her with an intensity that made her feel oddly exposed. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Miss Thorne." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite but distant. "I'm sorry for your loss. Tom spoke of you often." The formal words stung more than she'd expected. After months of intimate correspondence with Thomas, after sharing her hopes and dreams and fears with the man she'd never met but had come to care for deeply, this cold acknowledgement felt like salt in a fresh wound. "Thank you," she managed, fighting to keep her own voice steady. "I'm sorry for yours as well. The station master tells me the fire was sudden." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Pain, guilt, anger, she couldn't tell which. It was. The words were clipped, final, clearly ending that line of conversation. Jasper cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Thorne needs a place to stay." "I was telling her about Mrs. Henley's boarding house." Marcus's gaze sharpened. "You have family back east, someone who could send you passage money." The question, practical though it was, felt like another blow. Evangeline lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of pride she hadn't known she possessed. "No," she said simply. "There's no one." The three words hung in the air between them, heavy, with implication. She was truly alone in the world now, dependent on the charity of strangers, in a place that was as foreign to her as the moon. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his words were the last thing she expected to hear. "Tom made arrangements for your marriage." "Legal arrangements? Papers filed with the territorial court, a homestead claim in both your names." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, became almost calculating. "Those arrangements don't die with him." Evangeline stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Marcus said quietly, "that by territorial law, his claims and contracts can be assumed by his next of kin. His brother, for instance." The implications of his words hit her like a thunderbolt. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed. It again, her mind racing. Surely he couldn't be suggesting what she thought he was suggesting. "Marcus," Jasper said slowly, clearly as shocked as she was, "you can't be serious." But Marcus's eyes remained fixed on Evangeline's face, and in their depths she saw something that made her pulse quicken. Not love, not even affection, but a kind of grim determination that was somehow more unsettling than romantic feeling. Would have been. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice formal as a business proposition, "I'm offering to honor my brother's commitment, the marriage contract, the homestead, all of it, if you're willing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at Marcus Callahan, this stranger who bore her dead fiancé's features but none of his warmth. The practical part of her mind, the part that had gotten her through her father's bankruptcy and her mother's death, understood the cold logic of his offer. But her heart recoiled from the callousness of it. "You can't be serious," she whispered, echoing Jasper's words. "Your brother is dead 3 days, and you're already planning to... She couldn't finish the sentence. The very idea felt obscene. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm offering you a solution to a problem we both have, Miss Thorne. Nothing more, nothing less." A problem. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Your brother's death is a problem to be solved?" For the first time since his arrival, Marcus's carefully controlled expression cracked. Pain flashed across his features, raw, honest grief that he quickly masked behind that wall of stoic reserve. But Evangeline had seen it, and suddenly she understood that his cold proposition wasn't callousness at all. It was a man trying to honor his brother's memory the only way he knew how. "Tom wanted you to have a home here," Marcus said quietly. "He spent months preparing for your arrival, talking about the life you'd build together. Maybe I can't give you the man you were promised, but I can give you the security he wanted you to have." Jasper shifted uncomfortably beside them. "Folks, maybe this conversation should happen somewhere more private. Half the town's probably wondering what's got you two talking so intense-like on the platform." Indeed, Evangeline noticed several faces peering from windows along the main street, and a small group of men had gathered outside the general store, their attention clearly focused on the unusual scene at the station. Marcus followed her gaze and nodded curtly. "My wagon's at the Mercantile. I can take you to Mrs. Henley's boarding house, give you time to think about my offer." "And if I refuse?" Evangeline asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then you'll figure out another way to survive," Marcus replied with brutal honesty. "But I won't abandon my brother's intended bride to starve on the street. Whatever you decide, I'll see you have enough money for passage back east if that's what you want." The offer of charity stung worse than his marriage proposal had. Evangeline had grown up the daughter of a successful merchant, accustomed to comfort and security. The past year, watching her family's fortune crumble while her father drank himself into an early grave, had been humbling enough. But to be reduced to accepting handouts from a stranger— "I don't need your pity," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Good," Marcus replied, "because I'm not offering it." He moved to gather her, trunk from where the stage driver had deposited it, lifting the heavy piece of luggage as though it weighed nothing. The simple act highlighted the differences between him and his brother that she was only beginning to grasp. Thomas's letters had spoken of books and poetry, of dreams and gentle affections. This man was all action and hard practicality, and scarred by honest work, his movements economical and purposeful. As they walked toward his wagon, Evangeline found herself studying him covertly. He was taller than Thomas had appeared in his photograph, his shoulders broader, his entire bearing more commanding. Where Thomas had seemed gentle and scholarly, Marcus radiated a kind of controlled strength that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. "How did it happen?" she asked suddenly, then immediately regretted the question when she saw his shoulders tense. Marcus was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Tom had been drinking. More than usual. He paused, loading her trunk into the wagon bed with deliberate care. The broken wheel was crowded that night, celebrating some fool's poker winnings. Nobody noticed when the lamp got knocked over until the whole back wall was ablaze. Evangeline waited, sensing there was more. By the time anyone realized Tom was still inside, Marcus's hands stilled on the wagon's tailgate. "I tried to get to him, got as far as the doorway before the roof started coming down." The pain in his voice was unmistakable now, and Evangeline felt her anger toward him begin to soften. He blamed himself. That much was clear. Whether justly or not, he carried his brother's death as his own failure. "You couldn't have known," she said gently. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Couldn't I? Tom had been different these past months, drinking more, talking wild about things that didn't make sense. I should have been watching him closer. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a courtesy that seemed automatic, ingrained by years of frontier life, where a man's manners were often the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. As he climbed up beside her, Evangeline caught a glimpse of the man Thomas might have become, would have become, if he'd lived long enough to weather life's harder storms. The ride through Clearwater's main street was mercifully short. The town was smaller than she'd expected. Perhaps 24 buildings clustered around a central road that was more dirt than anything else. A few businesses, the general store, a blacksmith, what looked like a small restaurant, were still lit against the gathering darkness. Most of the houses they passed were modest affairs, though a few showed signs of recent prosperity that spoke of successful ranching or mining ventures. Mrs. Henley's boarding house stood at the far end of the street, a 2-story structure that had been painted white sometime in the recent past. Flower boxes beneath the windows and a well-maintained porch suggested a woman who took pride in her establishment, even in this rough corner of the territory. Marcus brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake, but made no immediate move to help her down. Instead, he sat staring at the boarding house as though it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. "Miss Thorne," he said finally, "I want you to understand something. If you accept my proposal, it won't be the marriage my brother promised you. I'm not Thomas. I don't have his way with words or his gentle nature. What I can offer is security, protection, and a chance to build something lasting in this country." Evangeline turned to study his profile in the dim light. "What would you get out of such an arrangement?" The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Tom's death left me with a ranch that's too big for one man to work alone," he said finally. "And there are complications that a wife might help resolve." Complications. But Marcus was already climbing down from the wagon, effectively ending that line of conversation. He came around to help her down, his hands strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her to the ground. For just a moment, they stood close together in the darkness, and Evangeline caught the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "Think about it," he said quietly. "Take whatever time you need, but understand that my offer comes with conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Marcus's smile was grim. "The kind that might make you reconsider taking charity instead." Before she could ask what he meant, the boarding house door opened, spilling warm yellow light across the porch. A plump woman in her 50s appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Marcus Callahan, is that you out there making noise in my front yard?" the woman called. Then her gaze fell on Evangeline, and her expression shifted to one of gentle curiosity. "And who might this lovely young lady be?" "Mrs. Henley," Marcus replied, touching his hat brim. "This is Miss Evangeline Thorne. She's in need of a room for the night." Mrs. Henley's face brightened with the particular pleasure of a woman who enjoyed having someone to mother. "Of course, dear. Come in, come in. You look half frozen and completely exhausted." As Marcus carried her trunk up the porch steps, Mrs. Henley took Evangeline's arm with maternal firmness. "Don't you worry about a thing, Miss Thorne. We'll get you fed and settled, and tomorrow everything will look much brighter." But as Evangeline glanced back at Marcus, standing silhouetted against the star-filled sky, she doubted that anything would look brighter tomorrow. If anything, the morning would only make her impossible situation more clear. She was trapped between accepting charity from a stranger and entering into a marriage that would be no marriage at all. Bound to a man who wore her dead fiancé's face, but harbored secrets he wouldn't share. The worst part was that she was actually considering his offer, and she couldn't decide whether that made her practical or desperate. Marcus touched his hat once more and turned to leave, but Mrs. Henley's voice stopped him. "Marcus Callahan, you tell me right now, Does this have something to do with your poor brother's passing?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus met Mrs. Henley's stern gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Miss Thorne was engaged to Tom," he said simply. "She came west to marry him." Mrs. Henley's sharp intake of breath spoke volumes. Her arm tightened protectively around Evangeline's shoulders, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of a woman who had seen too much of life's cruelties to tolerate any more. "Then she'll stay here as long as she needs, and I won't hear a word about payment until she's back on her feet." Her gaze fixed on Marcus with laser intensity. "And you, Marcus Callahan, will remember that this young lady has suffered a terrible loss and deserves to be treated accordingly." Something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or a warning. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Thorne." He touched his hat one final time. "I'll call on you tomorrow evening, if that's agreeable, to discuss your options." As his wagon disappeared into the darkness, Mrs. Henley guided Evangeline into the warmth and safety of the boarding house. But even surrounded by comfort and kindness, Evangeline couldn't escape the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a precipice, about to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. The question wasn't whether she trusted Marcus Callahan. She didn't, not entirely. The question was whether she trusted herself to survive whatever secrets he was hiding behind those dark, guarded eyes. Sleep eluded Evangeline that night, despite Mrs. Henley's comfortable feather bed and the exhaustion that weighed on her bones like stones. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's face from the tin-type photograph he'd sent, young and hopeful, with gentle eyes that had promised her safety and love. But the image kept shifting, transforming into Marcus's harder features, those dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. She rose before dawn and dressed quietly, needing air and space to think. The boarding house was still silent as she slipped onto the front porch, wrapping her shawl tightly against the mountain chill. Clearwater looked different in the pale pre-dawn light, smaller somehow, more fragile, like a collection of hopes, scattered across the vast wilderness rather than a real town. Couldn't sleep either, Evangeline startled, her hand flying to her throat. Marcus stood at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in his hands, looking as though he'd been there for some time. In the grey light, she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. "You've been here all night?" she asked. "Not all night." He climbed the steps, slowly, like a man walking to his own execution, just since about 3 o'clock. "Couldn't stop thinking about what I'd said to you, how it must have sounded." Evangeline pulled her shawl closer, studying his face. "And how did it sound?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the awakening town. "Cold, calculated. Like I was buying cattle instead of—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Instead of what? Instead of trying to honor a promise I made to a dying man." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Thomas was alive when you found him?" Marcus's face went grey, and she saw his hands tremble slightly before he clenched them into fists. "For a few minutes, long enough to make me swear I'd take care of you if anything happened to him." The revelation changed everything. This wasn't some cold business arrangement or an attempt to acquire a convenient wife. This was a man trying to keep a deathbed promise to his brother, no matter how impossible or painful it might be. "He knew he was dying," Evangeline whispered. The smoke had gotten to his lungs, but he was conscious, coherent, kept talking about how you'd given up everything to come west. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "He made me promise that if he didn't make it, I'd see you were provided for, protected." Evangeline sank into one of Mrs. Henley's porch chairs, her legs suddenly unable to support her. So this marriage proposal, it's duty, nothing more. I won't lie to you about that. Marcus turned to face her fully, and she saw raw honesty in his expression. I'm not offering you love, Miss Thorne. I'm not even sure I'm capable of it anymore. But I can offer you something my brother can't, a fighting chance at the life he promised you. The morning light was growing stronger now, and with it came the sounds of a town waking up. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, and smoke began rising from chimneys as people started their fires. Normal sounds of normal lives, while she sat on this porch, contemplating the most extraordinary decision she'd ever faced. "Tell me about these complications you mentioned," she said quietly, "the ones that a wife might help resolve." Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "There's a man named Harrison Pike who's been trying to buy up land in this valley. He's made offers on most of the smaller spreads, and when folks won't sell—" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "Let's say he finds other ways to encourage them. What kind of ways? Cattle go missing, fences get cut, barns catch fire." The last words carried particular weight, and Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think this Pike had something to do with your brother's death?" I think Tom started asking too many questions about Pike's business dealings, and I think the fire at the Broken Wheel was mighty convenient timing. The implications sent ice through her veins. "Are you saying Thomas was murdered?" Marcus was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm saying my brother was a careful man who'd been tending oil lamps his whole life. He wouldn't have knocked one over by accident, drunk or not." The pieces began falling into place. Thomas's increased drinking, his strange behavior in the weeks before her arrival, Marcus's guilt, and his desperate need to honor his brother's dying wish. This wasn't just about providing for a stranded woman. This was about justice and possibly revenge. "Why would marrying me help with Pike?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because a single man with no family can disappear easily. A married man with a wife asking questions, that's harder to make vanish without consequences." "You're asking me to be your protection," she said slowly. "A witness to whatever happens next." Sleep eluded Evangeline that night, despite Mrs. Henley's comfortable featherbed and the exhaustion that weighed on her bones like stones. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's face from the tintype photograph he'd sent, young and hopeful, with gentle eyes that had promised her safety and love. But the image kept shifting, transforming into Marcus's harder features, those dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. She rose before dawn and dressed quietly, needing air and space to think. The boarding house was still silent as she slipped onto the front porch, wrapping her shawl tightly against the mountain chill. Clearwater looked different in the pale pre-dawn light, smaller somehow, more fragile, like a collection of hopes, scattered across the vast wilderness rather than a real town. Couldn't sleep either, Evangeline startled, her hand flying to her throat. Marcus stood at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in his hands, looking as though he'd been there for some time. In the grey light, she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. "You've been here all night?" she asked. "Not all night." He climbed the steps, slowly, like a man walking to his own execution, just since about 3 o'clock. "Couldn't stop thinking about what I'd said to you, how it must have sounded." Evangeline pulled her shawl closer, studying his face. "And how did it sound?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the awakening town. "Cold. Calculated. Like I was buying cattle instead of—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Instead of what? Instead of trying to honor a promise I made to a dying man." The words hit her like a physical blow. Thomas was alive when you found him. Marcus's face went grey, and she saw his hands tremble slightly before he clenched them into fists. For a few minutes, long enough to make me swear I'd take care of you if anything happened to him. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't some cold business arrangement or an attempt to acquire a convenient wife. This was a man trying to keep a deathbed promise to his brother, no matter how impossible or painful it might be. He knew he was dying, Evangeline whispered. The smoke had gotten to his lungs, but he was conscious, coherent. Kept talking about you, about how you'd given up everything to come west. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. He made me promise that if he didn't make it, I'd see you were provided for, protected. Evangeline sank into one of Mrs. Henley's porch chairs, her legs suddenly unable to support her. So this marriage proposal, it's duty, nothing more. I won't lie to you about that. Marcus turned to face her fully, and she saw raw honesty in his expression. I'm not offering you love, Miss Thorne. I'm not even sure I'm capable of it anymore. But I can offer you something my brother can't, a fighting chance at the life he promised you. The morning light was growing stronger now, and with it came the sounds of a town waking up. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, and smoke began rising from chimneys as people started their fires. Normal sounds of normal lives, while she sat on this porch contemplating the most extraordinary decision she'd ever faced. Tell me about these complications you mentioned, she said quietly, the ones that a wife might help resolve. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. There's a man named Harrison Pike who's been trying to buy up land in this valley. He's made offers on most of the smaller spreads, and when folks won't sell... Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's say he finds other ways to encourage them. What kind of ways? Cattle go missing, fences get cut, barns catch fire. The last words carried particular weight, and Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. You think this Pike had something to do with your brother's death? I think Tom started asking too many questions about Pike's business dealings, and I think the fire at the Broken Wheel was mighty convenient timing. The implications sent ice through her veins. Are you saying Thomas was murdered? Marcus was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm saying my brother was a careful man who'd been tending oil lamps his whole life. He wouldn't have knocked one over. By accident, drunk or not, the pieces began falling into place. Thomas's increased drinking, his strange behavior in the weeks before her arrival, Marcus's guilt and his desperate need to honor his brother's dying wish. This wasn't just about providing for a stranded woman. This was about justice and possibly revenge. Why would marrying me help with Pike? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Because a single man with no family can disappear easily. A married man with a wife asking questions, that's harder to make vanish without consequences. You're asking me to be your protection, she said slowly, a witness to whatever happens next. The day passed in a haze of anxious preparation and mounting dread. Mrs. Henley, bless her practical soul, had taken charge of the situation with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. By noon, she'd somehow procured a simple white dress that needed only minor alterations, and by mid-afternoon, she was bustling around the boarding house kitchen, preparing what she insisted on calling a proper wedding breakfast for the morning. Evangeline tried to help, desperate for anything, to occupy her hands and distract her racing mind, but her fingers trembled so badly she could barely thread a needle. The reality of what she was about to do kept hitting her in waves. By tomorrow evening, she would be Mrs. Marcus Callahan, bound to a man she barely knew, embroiled in a conflict that had already cost one life. "Child, you're going to worry yourself into an early grave," Mrs. Henley chided gently, taking the mending from Evangeline's shaking hands. "Sit yourself down and drink some of that chamomile tea I made you." But the tea tasted like dust in her mouth, and sitting still only made her thoughts race faster. She found herself at the window again and again, watching the street for any sign of Marcus or this Harrison Pike she'd never met but already feared. Every shadow seemed to hold menace, every stranger's face a potential threat. As the afternoon wore on, other women began appearing at the boarding house door. Mrs. Patterson from the general store brought ribbon for the dress. Mrs. Chen, the Chinese laundry owner's wife, contributed delicate embroidered handkerchiefs that she pressed into Evangeline's hands with shy smiles and broken English congratulations. Even the stern-faced wife of the blacksmith appeared with a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers, their purple and yellow petals bright against the growing autumn gloom. "Word travels fast in a small town," Mrs. Henley explained, when Evangeline expressed amazement at the kindness of these women she'd never met. "And folks here understand about making the best of hard circumstances. Every one of these ladies has faced choices that would curl the hair of those fine Eastern society women." It was true, Evangeline realized, as she looked at the weathered faces around her. These women had followed husbands or fathers or their own desperate hopes into this harsh country. They understood what it meant to marry for survival, to build love from necessity rather than romance. Their acceptance of her situation was both comforting and heartbreaking. As evening approached, the women gradually departed, leaving behind gifts, good wishes, and an atmosphere of feminine solidarity that warmed Evangeline's heart despite her fears. Mrs. Henley was just lighting the lamps when boots sounded on the porch steps. Marcus arrived precisely at the time he'd promised, cleaned, up and wearing what was obviously his best shirt, though his face still carried the same grim determination she'd seen that morning. Mrs. Henley let him in with a maternal smile and immediately bustled off to check on something in the kitchen, leaving them alone in the parlour. "Miss Thorne," Marcus said formally, his hat in his hands again, "have you come to a decision?" Evangeline studied his face in the lamplight, searching for any sign of what lay beneath that careful composure. "I have several questions first." "Ask them. This morning you said Pike has been asking about me. What exactly has he been asking?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "When you were arriving, where you'd be staying, whether you had any family traveling with you. The kind of questions a man asks when he's planning something. And you think he means to harm me? I think he means to remove any complications to his plans. You represent a complication, Tom's widow, someone who might ask inconvenient questions. About his death, the clinical way he spoke of her potential murder should have been chilling, but instead, Evangeline found it oddly reassuring. Marcus wasn't trying to minimize the danger or protect her from harsh realities. He was treating her as an equal, capable of handling the truth. "If we marry," she said slowly, "what exactly would our daily life look like?" Marcus seemed surprised by the question. "I have a ranch about 5 miles outside town. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable. You'd have your own room, your privacy. During the day, I work the cattle and the land. Evenings—" He paused, clearly not having thought this through. "I suppose we'd have supper together, talk, try to make it look natural to anyone watching. And church? Social gatherings? The things married couples do?" "Yes." The word came out rougher than he'd intended. "We'd need to appear to be a real couple. Pike has eyes and ears throughout the valley." Evangeline nodded, filing away this information. "What about money? Would I have access to funds for household expenses, clothing, necessities?" "Of course. The ranch does well enough. You'd want for nothing." Marcus paused, then added quietly, "Tom left some things for you. Letters he never sent, a few gifts he'd bought for your arrival. They're yours by right. The mention of Thomas's unsent letters hit her harder than she'd expected. Somewhere in Marcus's house were words from the man she'd fallen in love with through correspondence, final thoughts he'd never had the chance to share. The idea of reading them was both precious and unbearable. "One more question," she said, her voice barely steady. "If we do this, if we marry and face whatever comes, is there any part of you that hopes it might become something real, something more than just duty and protection?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Marcus was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and carefully controlled. "Miss Thorne, I watched my brother burn to death 3 nights ago because I couldn't reach him in time. Before that, I watched the woman I planned to marry die of fever because the doctor couldn't get to our homestead through a spring flood. I'm not sure I have room in my heart for hope anymore." The raw pain in his words stole her breath. She'd known he was carrying guilt about Thomas's death, but she hadn't realized there were other losses, other failures that had carved away pieces of his soul. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know about—" "Her name was Catherine," Marcus continued, as if the words were being torn from him. "We were to be married the spring after she died. She was kind, gentle, nothing like—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Nothing like what?" "Nothing like the hard woman you'd have to become to survive what's coming." The words should have stung, but instead Evangeline found them oddly liberating. He wasn't expecting her to be sweet, docile, or accommodating. He was acknowledging that the situation would require strength, possibly ruthlessness. It was the most honest thing any man had ever said to her. "All right," she said quietly. Marcus looked up sharply. "All right. I'll marry you." The words came, out steadier than she felt. "Tomorrow morning, as you suggested." Relief flickered across his features, quickly replaced by something that might have been concern. "Miss Thorne, you should understand that once this is done, there may be no going back. Pike won't give up easily, and if he's willing to commit murder, then I'd rather face that as your partner than as a helpless victim hiding in a boarding house." Evangeline stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that were finally steady. "I came west to start a new life, Mr. Callahan. Perhaps this isn't the life I expected, but it's the one that's been offered to me." Marcus rose as well, and for a moment they stood facing each other in Mrs. Henley's cozy parlor, like two generals planning a campaign rather than a bride and groom discussing their wedding. "There's one more thing," Marcus said reluctantly. "The ceremony itself, for appearances, we'll need to make it seem genuine. That means we'll need to act like people in love," Evangeline finished. "I understand. Can you do that, knowing what you know about my reasons?" Evangeline thought of Thomas's letters, full of hope and gentle affection. She thought of the long journey west and the dreams she'd carried with her. Then she looked at Marcus's scarred hands, his guarded eyes, the weight of responsibility he carried like a physical burden. "Yes," she said simply, "I can do that." Mrs. Henley chose that moment to return from the kitchen, carrying a tea tray and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Well," she demanded, setting down the tray with enough force to rattle the cups, "have you two sorted things out?" "We're to be married tomorrow morning," Marcus said, his formal tone at odds with the momentous nature of the announcement. Mrs. Henley clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, wonderful! I'll have everything ready, don't you worry. The dress just needs a final hem, and I've prepared the most lovely breakfast." She bustled around them, already making lists aloud of everything that needed to be done. As Marcus prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Evangeline. "Miss Thorne, are you certain about this? Once we say the words, there'll be no changing your mind without consequences." "I'm certain," she replied, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Callahan, Yes? Tomorrow, when we're standing before the preacher. Could you call me by my given name, just for the ceremony? Something softened in his expression. Yes, Evangeline, I can do that. After he left, Mrs. Henley settled beside her on the sofa with 2 cups of tea, her earlier excitement giving way to maternal concern. Are you truly all right with this, dear? It's not too late to change your mind? Evangeline accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Mrs. Henley, may I ask you something personal? Of course. How did you end up in Clearwater? This doesn't seem like the kind of place a respectable boarding house proprietress would choose by accident. Mrs. Henley was quiet for a moment, staring into her tea. When she looked up, her eyes held the same shadows Evangeline had seen in Marcus's. I came here 20 years ago as a mail-order bride myself, she said quietly. My husband died in a mining accident 6 months after we married. I had a choice. Go back east with nothing or stay and make my own way. I chose to stay. Do you regret it some days? Mrs. Henley's smile was wistful. But this place grows on you, and these people become family. Sometimes the life you build from necessity turns out to be the life you needed all along. As they sat together in the comfortable parlor, surrounded by the evidence of Mrs. Henley's successful independence, Evangeline felt some of her fear beginning to transform into something else. Not quite hope. She wasn't ready for that yet, but a cautious sense of possibility. Tomorrow she would marry a stranger to honor a dead man's wishes and face a living man's threats. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd dreamed of, but it was real, immediate, and entirely her own choice. For a woman who had spent most of her life having choices made for her, that was perhaps enough. The wedding morning dawned grey and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains like a warning. Evangeline woke before sunrise, her stomach churning with a mixture of nerves and something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. Today, she would become Mrs. Marcus Callahan, bound to a man who'd made it clear he expected nothing from her but survival. Mrs. Henley was already bustling about the kitchen when Evangeline emerged, her arms full of white fabric that seemed to glow in the pre-dawn darkness. "Oh, good. You're awake," Mrs. Henley said, her voice unusually subdued. "I've been up since 3, putting the final touches on your dress. Come, let's get you ready." As Mrs. Henley helped her into the simple white gown, Evangeline caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The dress was beautiful in its simplicity. Clean lines that flattered her figure, delicate pearl, buttons that Mrs. Henley must have salvaged from some other garment. But it was her face that shocked her. Gone was the soft, hopeful expression she'd worn in Boston. In its place was something harder, more determined, the face of a woman who'd learned to make impossible choices. "You look beautiful, dear, Mrs." Henley said softly, adjusting the simple veil that had belonged to her own mother. "Different than when you arrived, but beautiful all the same." A knock at the front door interrupted them. Mrs. Henley went to answer it, returning with a small, wrapped package. "From Marcus," she explained, handing it to Evangeline. "He said it was something that belonged to Thomas, meant for you." With trembling fingers, Evangeline unwrapped the package to reveal a delicate gold locket, its surface worn smooth with age. Inside was a tiny photograph of a woman with kind eyes and Thomas's gentle smile, his mother, she realized. On the opposite side, someone had carefully inscribed the words, "For my beloved Evangeline, with all my heart." T. The locket hit her like a physical blow. Thomas had planned to give this to her on their wedding day, had perhaps carried it in his pocket that terrible night at the Broken Wheel Saloon. She pressed it to her chest, feeling the weight of dreams that would never be fulfilled. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Henley whispered, wrapping her in a maternal embrace as the tears finally came. "Let it out. Today, of all days, you have the right to grieve." They stood together in the morning light, two women who'd learned that sometimes love meant letting go of what you'd hoped for and embracing what was possible. When Evangeline's tears finally subsided, Mrs. Henley helped her fasten the locket around her neck, where it rested just above her heart. "There," Mrs. Henley said firmly. "Now you carry a piece of the love that brought you here, and you're ready to face whatever comes next." The ceremony was to take place at the small church at the end of Main Street. As they walked through town, Evangeline was surprised to see how many people had gathered, despite the early hour and threatening weather. It seemed half of Clearwater had turned out to witness the hasty wedding, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and something that looked like protectiveness. Marcus was waiting at the altar, looking uncomfortable in a black suit that was clearly his best, but rarely worn. When he saw her walking down the aisle, something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps or appreciation. For a moment he looked less like a man fulfilling a grim duty and more like a bridegroom greeting his bride. The preacher, a thin man with kind eyes and a voice suited to comfort rather than condemnation, kept the ceremony brief but dignified. As they spoke their vows, Evangeline found herself studying Marcus's face, searching for any sign of what he was feeling. His voice was steady as he promised to love, honor, and protect her, but his eyes held shadows that spoke of sacrifices. She was only beginning to understand. When the time came for him to kiss her, Marcus hesitated for just a moment. Then his hands came up to frame her face with surprising gentleness, and his lips touched hers in a kiss that was meant to convince the watching crowd, but somehow felt more real than anything that had happened since her arrival in Clearwater. "You may now pronounce them husband and wife," the preacher announced, and the small crowd erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to chase away some of the morning's gloom. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. As they walked back down the aisle together, Marcus's hand warm and steady at her elbow, Evangeline caught sight of a man standing at the back of the church who hadn't been there during the ceremony. He was well dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money and influence, but there was something about his pale eyes and thin smile that made her skin crawl. Marcus must have seen him too, because his grip on her arm tightened, almost imperceptibly. When they reached the back of the church, the stranger stepped forward with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. Callahan," the man said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Congratulations on your marriage. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting your lovely bride." "Pike," Marcus replied, his voice flat and carefully controlled. "What do you want?" So this was Harrison Pike. Evangeline studied him with new eyes, taking in the expensive watch chain, the manicured hands, the way he carried himself like a man who'd never had to worry about physical labor or physical consequences. He looked like a successful businessman, which somehow made him more frightening than if he'd appeared obviously villainous. "I wanted to offer my congratulations, of course," Pike said, his pale eyes fixing on Evangeline with uncomfortable intensity. "And to express my condolences for the loss of your brother. Such a tragedy, that fire, so unexpected." The way he said the word unexpected sent chills down Evangeline's spine. There was nothing accidental about Thomas's death in Pike's tone, only satisfaction and a warning. "My wife and I appreciate your concern," Marcus said, emphasizing the word wife in a way that made Pike's eyes narrow slightly. "Wife," Pike repeated thoughtfully. "How lovely. I do hope you'll both be very settled in the valley. It would be such a shame if circumstances forced you to relocate." "We're not going anywhere," Evangeline said quietly, speaking for the first time since Pike's arrival. "This is our home now." Pike's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Callahan, though I hope you understand that sometimes even the most devoted couples find that frontier life doesn't suit them. The isolation, the dangers. Why, just last month, the Hendersons decided to sell their spread and return to Kansas. Such a wise decision, given the unfortunate incidents they'd been experiencing. The threat was delivered with such casual politeness that it took Evangeline's breath away. This man had just threatened them at their own wedding, surrounded by friends and neighbors, and done it with such smooth courtesy that anyone overhearing might think he was simply making conversation. "The Hendersons were getting on in years," Marcus replied evenly. "My wife and I are just starting our lives together. We plan to be here for a very long time." "I'm sure you do," Pike said, tipping his hat to Evangeline with mock courtesy. "Well, I won't keep you from your wedding celebration. I'm sure you have plans for the day." As he walked away, several of the wedding guests who'd been chatting nearby fell silent, their faces reflecting the same unease Evangeline felt. Pike's presence had cast a shadow over what should have been a joyful occasion, and everyone seemed to understand that they'd just witnessed something significant. "Come," Marcus said quietly, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "Let's go home." The word home sent another wave of unreality through her. In the space of an hour, she'd acquired a husband, a home, and an enemy. As they walked toward Marcus's wagon, she found herself gripping Thomas's locket like a talisman, drawing strength from the love that had brought her to this moment. Mrs. Henley bustled up to them as they prepared to leave, pressing a large basket into Evangeline's hands. "Wedding breakfast," she explained, though her eyes were worried as they tracked Pike's retreating figure. "And enough food for several days, just in case you prefer to stay close to home for a while." The older woman's concern was touching, but it also highlighted the reality of their situation. Even on their wedding day, they were already living under the shadow of Pike's threats. As Marcus helped her into the wagon, Evangeline looked back at the small crowd of well-wishers gathered on the church steps. These people had welcomed her, supported her, treated her as one of their own, despite knowing her for less than 2 days. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let Pike drive her away from the first place that had felt like home since her parents' deaths. The ride to Marcus's ranch passed in contemplative silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The landscape was beautiful despite the threatening clouds. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, stands of aspen trees already turning gold with the advancing season, mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Evangeline was surprised by what she saw. She'd expected something rough and utilitarian, but Marcus's home was a solid 2-story house with a wraparound porch and flower beds that showed evidence of careful tending. It looked like a place where a man might raise a family, build a future, the kind of home Thomas had described in his letters. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and Marcus looked genuinely pleased by her reaction. "Tom helped me build it," he said, climbing down from the wagon and coming around to help her. "We always planned that when one of us married, the other would build his own place nearby. Seems fitting that you should be the one to christen it as a real home." As he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. When she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The beginning of something that might, given time and trust, grow into something real. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callahan," he said quietly. And for the first time since her arrival in Clearwater, Evangeline allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she might actually survive what was coming. But as they stood together on the porch of their new home, dark clouds gathering overhead and the memory of Pike's threat still fresh in their minds, she knew that survival would require more than hope. It would require the kind of strength she'd never been asked to find before, and the kind of partnership that could withstand whatever storms were heading their way. Their first evening as husband and wife passed in careful politeness that felt more fragile than any of the china Mrs. Henley had packed in her wedding basket. Marcus showed Evangeline through the house with the formal courtesy of a hotel proprietor, pointing out the kitchen, the parlor, the room that would be hers, carefully emphasizing the separate sleeping arrangements they'd discussed. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside, built with obvious care and attention to detail. Thomas's influence was everywhere, in the built-in bookshelves lined with volumes of poetry, in the delicate curtains that softened the masculine furniture, in the careful placement of windows to catch the morning light. This had been meant to be Thomas's home with her, and walking through it felt like touring a museum of dreams that would never be fulfilled. "The bedroom at the end of the hall is yours," Marcus said, pausing at the foot of the stairs. Tom spent weeks getting it, ready, choosing the wallpaper, arranging the furniture. He wanted everything to be perfect for your arrival. Evangeline's throat tightened. "And where will you sleep?" "There's a small room off the kitchen that I've been using. It suits me well enough." Marcus's tone was carefully neutral, but she caught the underlying message. He wouldn't impose on her space or privacy any more than their arrangement required. As they ate Mrs. Henley's wedding supper in the formal dining room, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. They were strangers, playing at being married, two people bound by necessity rather than affection, and the awkwardness of it settled over them like a heavy blanket. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence. "There are things you should know. About living here, about staying safe." Evangeline set down her fork, grateful for anything that felt like honest conversation. "Tell me." "The nearest neighbor is the Jameson place, about 2 miles north. Good people, but Pikes made them an offer on their land too. They're wavering." Marcus's expression darkened. "If they sell, we'll be more isolated than I'd like." "What exactly has Pike done to convince people to sell?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. "The Hendersons I mentioned? Their prize bull was found dead in their pasture, throat cut. The week before they accepted Pike's offer, their barn burned down. Insurance fire, the marshal called it, but there was no lightning that night." The casual recitation of violence made Evangeline's blood run cold. "And the authorities do nothing?" "Pike's careful. Never anything that can be traced directly back to him, and he's got influence, friends in the territorial capital, business connections. The local marshal's a good man, but he's outgunned." Marcus met her eyes across the table. "That's why your presence here matters. A married man with a wife asking questions draws different attention than a bachelor who might simply disappear." "You really think he'd murder you outright?" "I think my brother thought he was safe too." The stark reminder of Thomas's fate sent a chill through the room. Evangeline found herself touching the locket at her throat, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. "What can I do to help?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked surprised by the question. "Help? You said we were partners in this. Partners share the work." Evangeline leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. "I may not know about ranching or frontier life, but I'm not helpless. I can shoot. My father taught me. I can ride well enough, and I can certainly ask the kind of questions that might make Pike uncomfortable." Something shifted in Marcus's expression as he studied her. "You'd be willing to put yourself at risk?" "I'm already at risk. The question is whether I face that risk as a victim or as someone fighting back." For the first time since she'd met him, Marcus smiled, not the polite, careful expression he'd worn at their wedding, but something genuine and warm that transformed his entire face. "Tom always said you had spirit. I'm beginning to understand what he meant." They spent the rest of the evening planning, mapping out the valley and the properties Pike had targeted, discussing the patterns of intimidation and violence that had driven families away. It felt good to have a purpose, something concrete to focus on, instead of the strange intimacy of sharing a home with a man who was essentially a stranger. When they finally retired for the night, Evangeline found Thomas's room exactly as Marcus had described, prepared with loving care for a bride who would never see her wedding night. The wallpaper was pale blue, scattered with tiny roses. The furniture was delicate and feminine, and on the dressing table sat a small collection of books, poetry and novels that Thomas had chosen specifically for her, their pages still crisp and unread. She changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at those unopened books. Tomorrow she would begin the work of building a new life with a man she barely knew, fighting an enemy who'd already proven his willingness to kill. But tonight, in this room that had been prepared with such hope and love, she allowed herself to mourn what she'd lost. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of fire and faceless threats. She woke several times to unfamiliar sounds, the settling of the house, the wind in the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle. Each noise sent her heart racing until she remembered where she was and why. It was during one of these wakeful periods, sometime after midnight, that she heard something that definitely didn't belong, the soft creak of a floorboard on the porch below her window. Evangeline slipped from bed and moved carefully to the window, staying in the shadows as she peered out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light, and in that light she could see a figure moving stealthily around the side of the house. Too large to be an animal, too careful to be a neighbor with legitimate business at this hour. Her heart pounding, she grabbed her robe and crept from her room. Marcus's door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and she could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. But as she moved closer, intending to wake him, the breathing stopped. "I see him too," Marcus's voice came softly from the darkness. "Stay back from the windows." Evangeline heard the soft rustle of movement. Then Marcus appeared in his doorway, fully dressed and carrying a rifle. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to danger, checking the load on his weapon with practiced ease. "How many?" she whispered. "At least 2, maybe more." His voice was grimly calm. "They're trying to circle the house." A new sound reached them, the soft whinny of a horse somewhere in the darkness beyond the barn. Whoever was out there had brought backup, and they'd been careful enough to leave their mounts at a distance to avoid detection. "What do they want?" Evangeline asked, though she suspected she already knew. "To send a message. Show us we're not as safe as we think." Marcus moved to another window, peering out carefully, or maybe Pike decided that a wedding gift was in order. The casual way he spoke of potential violence should have terrified her. But instead Evangeline felt a strange calm settling over her. This was what they'd expected, what they'd prepared for. In a way, it was almost a relief to have the waiting over. "Where do you keep the other guns?" she asked quietly. Marcus turned to stare at her. "You said you could shoot, but I didn't think—" "You didn't think I meant it." Evangeline's smile was sharp-edged. "Mr. Callahan, I didn't travel 2,000 miles to die in my nightgown on my wedding night. Now where are the guns?" A slow grin spread across Marcus's face, and for a moment he looked less like a grieving brother and more like a man who'd just discovered an unexpected ally. "Gun cabinets in the parlor," he said. "Ammunition's in the top drawer. Can you handle a Winchester?" "Better than you might expect." As she started toward the stairs, Marcus caught her arm gently. "Evangeline." It was the first time he'd used her given name outside of their wedding vows, and something in his voice made her pause. "Whatever happens tonight, whatever we have to do, it doesn't make us like them." She understood what he was trying to tell her. Violence in defense of home and family was different from the calculated cruelty Pike employed to get his way. But looking into Marcus's eyes, she wondered if the distinction would matter when the shooting started. "I know," she said softly, But Marcus, if they hurt you, if they try to burn this house the way they burned the saloon, I will become exactly like them, and I won't lose a moment's sleep over it." The promise hung between them like a vow, more binding than the ones they'd spoken in church. Whatever else their marriage might or might not become, they were united in this. Neither would allow the other to be destroyed by Harrison Pike's ambitions. Outside, a board creaked on the front porch. Their enemies were getting bolder, moving closer. The real test of their partnership was about to begin, and Evangeline discovered that she was ready for it. The frightened Eastern bride who'd stepped off the stagecoach 3 days ago was gone. In her place stood a woman prepared to fight for the life she was building, one bullet at a time if necessary. "This isn't over," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "Pike's got more men, more resources. You can't watch your backs forever." "Maybe not," Marcus replied, stepping into the firelight with his rifle trained on the former cavalry sergeant. "But we don't have to watch them forever, just long enough." "Long enough for what?" Marcus's smile was as cold as the mountain air. "Long enough for people to start asking questions about where all Pike's hired guns keep disappearing to. Long enough for word to spread that there are easier targets than the Callahan Ranch. Long enough for Pike to realize that some fights cost more than they're worth." Morrison's laugh was bitter. "You think killing a few men will make Pike back down? You don't know him at all." "No," Evangeline said, stepping out of the shadows with her own rifle ready. "But he doesn't know us either, and that's his mistake." Something in her voice made Morrison take a step backward. In the firelight, with her white nightgown stained with smoke and blood, her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes reflecting the flames, she looked like an avenging angel, beautiful and terrible and utterly implacable. "Tell Pike," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd discovered her own strength, "that Mrs. Callahan sends her regards, and tell him that the next time he wants to deliver a message, he should come himself. We'll be waiting." Morrison holstered his empty gun and backed toward his horse, never taking his eyes off them. "This isn't over," he repeated. But the threat sounded hollow now, delivered by a man who'd just learned that his intended victims were far more dangerous than anyone had expected. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Marcus and Evangeline stood together in the yard of their burning home, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies and the ruins of Thomas's dreams. But they were alive, they were together, and they had sent Pike a message he wouldn't soon forget. "What now?" Evangeline asked, suddenly aware of how her hands were shaking, how the adrenaline was beginning to ebb and leave her feeling hollow and strange. Marcus looked at the house, where flames were still consuming the upper floor, but the main structure seemed salvageable. Then he looked at her, his eyes reflecting something that hadn't been there before. Not love, not yet, but respect and partnership, and the beginning of something that might someday grow into more. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. "We make it stronger than before, and we get ready for whatever Pike sends next." As dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise, Marcus and Evangeline Callahan stood amid the ashes of their wedding night and began planning their war. The Winchester felt solid and familiar in Evangeline's hands as she took position at the parlor window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the lace curtains Thomas had chosen, she could see shadows moving with deliberate purpose around. The barn, 3 men, maybe 4, spreading out to surround the house just as Marcus had predicted. "They're not trying to be quiet anymore," Marcus whispered from his position near the front door. "That means they're ready to make their move." As if to confirm his words, a bottle came sailing through the darkness, trailing flame like a comet. It shattered against the side of the house with a sound like breaking dreams, and immediately the smell of coal oil and fire filled the night air. "Trying to smoke us out," Marcus said grimly, working the lever on his rifle, "just like the saloon." The parallel to Thomas's death sent ice through Evangeline's veins. These men weren't just trying to intimidate them. They were recreating the murder that had brought her and Marcus together, turning their wedding night into a funeral pyre. Another bottle arced through the darkness, this one aimed at the front porch. The flames caught quickly on the dry wood, casting dancing shadows that turned the familiar landscape into something from a nightmare. In the hellish light, Evangeline could finally see their attackers clearly. The leader was a man she didn't recognize, tall and lean with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. But it was the way he moved, the casual confidence with which he directed the others, that told her this wasn't random violence. This was professional work, carried out by men who'd done this kind of thing before. Pike's hired guns, Marcus confirmed, reading her thoughts. The tall one's Jake Morrison. Used to be a cavalry sergeant before he got discharged for brutality. The others are drifters he's picked up along the way. A third bottle flew toward the kitchen window, but this time Evangeline was ready. Her rifle barked once, the bullet shattering the bottle in midair and sending flaming oil cascading harmlessly to the ground. The sudden destruction of their firebomb seemed to surprise the attackers, who clearly hadn't expected effective resistance. "Nice shot," Marcus said with genuine admiration. "But now they know we're armed and ready. Things are about to get more serious." As if summoned by his words, muzzle flashes erupted from multiple directions as Pike's men opened fire on the house. Bullets splintered the window frames and punched holes in the walls, filling the air with the sound of destruction and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Evangeline pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her breath coming in short gasps. This was different from target practice with her father. These men were shooting to kill, and every bullet that flew past her head was a reminder of how quickly her new life could end. "Stay down," Marcus called over the gunfire. "Let them waste their ammunition. When they reload, we'll make our move." But even as he spoke, Evangeline could see the orange glow growing brighter outside. The porch was fully engulfed now, and flames were beginning to lick at the eaves. Soon the whole house would be ablaze, and they'd be forced to run directly into the guns of their attackers. "Marcus," she called, her voice tight with controlled fear. "The fire's spreading faster than they expected. We need to get out of here." "I know." His voice carried the same grim determination she'd heard when he'd proposed to her. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen with an outside entrance. If we can reach it—" The sentence was cut off by the sound of breaking glass from upstairs. Someone had managed to get close enough to throw another fire bottle through a bedroom window. Thomas's room, she realized with a stab of grief. The room he'd prepared with such love and care was being consumed by the same flames that had killed him. Rage, pure and hot as the fire surrounding them, flooded through her. These men weren't just trying to kill her and Marcus. They were destroying the last tangible evidence of Thomas's dreams, the home he'd built with hope and love. The violation of it was more than she could bear. "Cover me," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Evangeline, what are you—" But she was already moving, using the smoke and chaos to her advantage as she slipped toward the kitchen. The back door was still intact, though flames were beginning to climb the exterior walls. Through the window, she could see one of Pike's men circling toward the rear of the house, probably planning to block their escape route to the root cellar. He never saw her coming. The kitchen door opened soundlessly, and Evangeline stepped into the night with her rifle raised. The man was less than 20 feet away, his attention focused on the burning house rather than the shadows behind him. Her father's training served her well. Breathe, aim, squeeze gently. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and Pike's gunman crumpled to the ground without a sound. "Jesus," Marcus's voice came from behind her, filled with a mixture of shock and approval. "Remind me never to get on your bad side. One down," Evangeline said simply, working the lever to chamber another round. "How many left?" Before Marcus could answer, shouts erupted from the front of the house. The remaining attackers had discovered their companion's fate and were regrouping, their earlier confidence shaken by the realization that their prey had teeth. "This way," Marcus said, leading her toward the root cellar. "We can circle around, get behind them while they're focused on the house." The cellar was exactly where he'd said it would be, a sturdy structure built into the hillside, designed to store vegetables and preserve food through the long mountain winters. More importantly, it provided cover and a different angle of attack on their enemies. As they settled into position, Evangeline found herself studying Marcus's profile in the firelight. The careful, controlled man she'd married that morning was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. This was what Pike's violence had awakened, not just her own capacity for deadly action, but Marcus's transformation back into the kind of man who could match brutality with brutality. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, perhaps sensing her scrutiny. "You could stay here, stay safe. This isn't your fight." "Isn't it?" Evangeline's voice was steady despite the chaos. Surrounding them, they burned Thomas's room. "They're trying to destroy everything he built, everything he hoped for. If that's not my fight, then what is?" Marcus nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Then let's finish this." They moved through the darkness like hunting wolves, using the terrain and the distraction of the burning house to their advantage. Pike's men were good at intimidation and arson, but they weren't prepared for a coordinated defense by people who knew the land and had everything to lose. The next few minutes were a blur of movement, gunfire, and careful positioning. Marcus took down another attacker with a shot that spoke of military training, while Evangeline used her smaller size and unexpected presence to flush a third man into Marcus's line of fire. When the smoke cleared, literally and figuratively, Jake Morrison stood alone in the yard, his rifle empty and his companions either dead or fled. The house was still burning, but the flames were contained enough that they might save part of it. More importantly, they were alive and victorious. 3 months later, the rebuilt Callahan Ranch stood as a testament to both destruction and renewal. The house was smaller now, more practical than Thomas's original dream, but it was theirs in a way the first had never been. Every board they'd hammered, every window they'd installed, every room they'd planned together had been born from their shared determination to survive and thrive, despite Pike's threats. The partnership that had been forged in gunfire had evolved into something deeper during the long days of reconstruction. Marcus and Evangeline worked side by side, their initial awkwardness giving way to an easy companionship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They still maintained separate bedrooms, still treated their marriage as a practical arrangement. But something fundamental had shifted in the way they moved around each other, spoke to each other, planned their future together. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Evangeline prepared breakfast, her movements efficient and sure. She'd learned to cook on a wood stove, to preserve meat and vegetables, to manage a household in the wilderness. The soft Eastern lady who'd stepped off the stagecoach was gone, replaced by someone tougher, more capable, more herself than she'd ever been in Boston's drawing rooms. Marcus entered from the barn, his hair damp from washing at the well, his shirt clean, but bearing the permanent stains of honest work. 3 months of marriage had changed him too. The grim desperation that had driven his initial proposal had given way to something calmer, more hopeful. He still carried the weight of Thomas's death, still woke sometimes in the night with his brother's name on his lips, but the sharp edges of grief had begun to soften. "Coffee smells good," he said, settling at the table they'd built together from salvaged lumber. "Any word from town?" Evangeline poured his coffee, noting the way his fingers lingered on hers when she handed him the cup. These small touches had become more frequent lately, unconscious gestures that spoke of growing intimacy, despite their careful boundaries. "Mrs. Henley sent word yesterday," The Jamesons finally sold to Pike, packed up and left for Oregon Territory. That makes 7 families in the past month. She sat across from him, her own coffee warming her hands. We're more isolated than ever, Marcus nodded grimly. Pike's campaign of intimidation had been largely successful. Most of the smaller ranchers had taken his offers and fled, leaving vast stretches of the valley under his control. But his methods had grown more sophisticated since the failed attack on their ranch. No more hired guns or obvious violence. Instead, he turned to economic pressure, legal manipulations, and the kind of subtle coercion that was harder to fight but equally effective. Sheriff Coleman rode out yesterday while you were in the North Pasture, Evangeline continued. Pike's filed a claim disputing our water rights. Says Thomas never properly registered them with the territorial authority. And Coleman says we'll need to appear before the territorial judge next month to prove our claim. If we can't... She didn't need to finish. Without water rights, the ranch would be worthless, and they'd be forced to sell to Pike at whatever price, he offered. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. When he looked up, his expression was thoughtful rather than defeated. Maybe it's time we stopped playing defense, he said quietly. What do you mean? I mean, Pike's been picking us off one by one, using the law and economic pressure because direct violence failed. But he's got weaknesses too, businesses that depend on his reputation, political connections that wouldn't survive scrutiny. Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity that always appeared when he was planning. What if we started asking questions about where his money really comes from, started making noise about the convenient timing of all these fires and accidents? Evangeline felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of taking action rather than simply enduring. That's dangerous. If Pike realizes we're investigating him, then he'll make mistakes. Desperate men always do. Marcus's smile was sharp-edged. Besides, we've got advantages he doesn't expect. You can go places I can't, ask questions. That would seem suspicious coming from me. And people underestimate you. They see a refined Eastern lady and assume you're helpless. While you do what? While I make sure our legal position is solid and start reaching out to the families Pike hasn't pressured yet. Build alliances, share information, make him fight on multiple fronts instead of picking us off individually. The plan was risky, but it was also the first time since their wedding night that Evangeline felt truly hopeful. They'd proven they could defend their home. Now it was time to prove they could take the fight to their enemy. Over the following weeks, their strategy began to take shape. Evangeline made regular trips to town, cultivating friendships with the wives and daughters of merchants, listening to gossip, asking carefully casual questions about Pike's business dealings. What she learned was disturbing but useful. Pike's empire was built on more than just land acquisition. There were rumors of partnerships with less than reputable mining operations, speculation about government contracts awarded under suspicious circumstances, whispers about money that flowed through his businesses without any clear source. Meanwhile, Marcus worked to organize the remaining ranchers into a loose alliance. It wasn't easy. Pike's intimidation tactics had made people cautious about standing together, but fear of being the next target eventually overcame fear of retaliation. Slowly, a network of communication and mutual support began to emerge. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jenny Martinez, the young woman who worked as Pike's secretary, approached Evangeline after church one Sunday with information that changed everything. "Mrs. Callahan," Jenny whispered, glancing around nervously to make sure they weren't overheard, "I need to speak with you privately. It's about Mr. Pike and what happened to your husband's brother." They met that afternoon at an abandoned line shack on the edge of Marcus's property, far from prying eyes and listening ears. Jenny was terrified but determined, her hands shaking as she pulled a leather portfolio from beneath her shawl. "I've been keeping copies," she said without preamble. Letters, contracts, telegrams, everything that passes through Mr. Pike's office. I didn't understand what most of it meant until I heard you and your husband were asking questions. Evangeline opened the portfolio and felt her breath catch. The documents inside painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond simple land grabbing. Pike was involved in illegal mining operations on federal land, using his political connections to secure fraudulent permits and silence inconvenient investigations. The money from these operations was being used to fund his land acquisitions, creating a criminal empire that stretched across 3 territories. "This is incredible," Evangeline breathed. "But why are you showing me this? What do you want in return?" Jenny's young face hardened with determination that reminded Evangeline of herself 3 months ago. "Because my brother Carlos works for the mining operation Pike's been protecting. Last month there was a cave-in. 6 men died, including Carlos. Pike's people said it was an accident, but Carlos had written to me just days before saying the mine wasn't safe, that they were cutting corners to increase profits. The parallel to Thomas's death was unmistakable. Pike's criminal activities were claiming innocent lives, and like Marcus, Jenny wanted justice for her lost family member. "What do you need from us?" Evangeline asked. "Protection. When these documents become public, Pike will know they came from me. I'll need somewhere safe to stay until the authorities can act." Jenny's voice was steady despite her obvious fear. "And I want your promise that you'll make sure the families of those dead miners get justice." "You have it," Evangeline said without hesitation. "Both promises." That evening, she and Marcus pored over the documents by lamplight, their excitement growing as they realized the scope of what Jenny had provided. This wasn't just evidence of Pike's guilt. It was proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "This changes everything," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "We're not just fighting a land grabber anymore. We're taking on a criminal organization with federal connections." "Ah, you having second thoughts?" Marcus looked at her across the table, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight, and something deeper, a fierce protectiveness that made her heart skip despite herself. "No," he said quietly, "but I want you to understand what we're risking. If we move against Pike with this information, there's no going back. He'll use every resource at his disposal to destroy us." Evangeline thought of Thomas, of the dreams that had burned with him in the Broken Wheel Saloon. She thought of Carlos Martinez and the 6 miners who died for Pike's profits. She thought of all the families who'd been driven from their homes by fear and intimidation. "Then we'd better make sure we succeed," she said simply. As they began planning their next move, neither noticed the shadow that moved past the kitchen window or the figure that melted back into the darkness after watching them through the glass. Pike's network of spies was more extensive than they'd realized, and their enemy now knew they possessed information that could destroy him. The real war was about to begin, and this time Pike wouldn't underestimate his opponents. He'd learned from his previous failures, and when he moved against them again, it would be with the full force of his criminal empire behind him. But Marcus and Evangeline had learned too. They'd discovered not just their own capacity for violence and deception, but something more powerful, their capacity to trust each other completely, to fight as true partners rather than reluctant allies. The foundation of their marriage might have been duty and necessity, but what they'd built on that foundation was proving to be something much stronger. Whether it would be strong enough to survive what was coming remained to be seen. Outside their warm kitchen, the Colorado winter was settling over the valley like a promise of harder times ahead. But inside, 2 people who'd found each other in the ashes of tragedy were preparing to bet everything on justice, truth, and the fragile hope that love might yet grow from the strangest of beginnings. The final confrontation with Harrison Pike was approaching, And when it came, it would test not just their courage and cunning, but the very bonds that held their unconventional marriage together. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.